Back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our core data tutorial series. Now in this particular video, or in this particular tutorial, we are going to be taking a look at how we can create entities in core data. Now before we begin, I do want to bring up something that I didn't bring up in the last video when we were configuring a core data app in SwiftUI. So in the persistent controller, we had a couple additional things that we didn't implement in our data controller initially, and we can implement that stuff here in our data controller. So if you want to do that, what we can do is we can have a private var called in-memory, and we'll set that to be a Boolean. And then we can have an initializer where we have in-memory. This can be a Boolean. And we'll set it to a default value of false. And then we'll say self.inMemory equals in-memory. All right. Then inside of our lazy variable here for our persistent container, between our constant for the persistent container and loading the persistent stores, we can place if in memory. So if we do want our data stored to be in memory, we can copy paste this particular line from our persistent controller. So container dot persistent store descriptions dot first dot URL equals a URL object a file URL with path, and then /dev/null, which, as mentioned before, will basically tell core data, hey, make sure that our persistent store is in memory and not in a SQLite database on the actual system's disk. All right. And so with that, you have made sure that that functionality is in there. We can also make sure that our container's view context. We can also make sure that the container's view context has that one property initialized, where we can say container dot view context dot automatically merges changes from parent equals true, and there we go. All right, so with that, we have our container configured precisely how we have it configured in our persistence controller. Now, you can also initialize the persistent container in the data controller's initializer, and that would work fine as well. But using a lazy variable works fine as well. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and start talking about entities. What are entities? Well, in core data, an entity essentially represents a table in our SQLite database. An entity can have various attributes of varying different types, such as doubles, floats, strings, booleans, binary data, and various kinds of integers of varying precision levels. To create these entities, we use a core data model file with the extension xcdatamodel.d. We have one already in our project. So we can go into our project navigator. And then we can find, there we go, tutorial app SwiftUI core data .xcdatamodel.d. It's a core data versioned data model file here. And you can see here in our SwiftUI project, it gives us one entity by default, and that is item. Now, item has one property called timestamp, and that is of type date. We don't have to worry too much about this item entity. So what we can do is we can select item and delete it. So now we have no entities in our data model, which is what you get by default in iOS and AppKit projects that use core data. The data model is empty. There's no example entities to be found. Now, how do we create a new entity? Well, that's actually relatively simple because in the core data model editor, there is an add entity button. So we can just get rid of that entity here. And we can hit add entity. We'll call this entity project. So I will call it project, and then we'll create a second entity called task item. Add entity, and we'll call it we'll call it task item, like that. So now we have two entities, project and task item. Let's go ahead and select, we'll go ahead and select project here. And then we'll go into the attributes disclosure group, and we have an empty table here. You can see where we have a column for the name of the attribute and a column for its data type. Beneath that table, we have two buttons, an add and a delete or remove button. Depending, what we can do with these buttons, of course, is the plus button will allow us to add an attribute, and then the remove button will allow us to remove one or more attributes that we have selected in the table. So go ahead and add an attribute, and we're going to call this ID, Now, you don't have to give an ID field because core data behind the scenes generates an ID for you. But I sometimes like to do it this way because maybe you want to make sure that this is a UUID or something like that. Whereas core data does something special on its own. And we'll make this a UUID. So again, you don't have to have an ID attribute. Many times you're not going to have an ID attribute, and you're just going to rely on core data to generate a unique identifier in the database for you. But you can provide one if you want. We'll add another attribute, and we'll say name. Now, let's kind of go through some of these other types. Here in core data, we have many types that we can work with. We have integer 16, integer 32, and integer 64 for the kinds of integers we can use. This is one of those things that shows core data's age, right? So you don't have to use an integer if you don't want to for certain for different attributes. The data type you use is entirely up to you, but if you do choose to use an integer, any of these three will work. You just have to remember that you can't use just int, because that's not going to work. Int is not the same as integer 16 or integer 32 or integer 64. Of course, the number indicates how many bits it is. So integer 16 is a 16-bit integer. Integer 32 is a 32-bit integer. And integer 64 is a 64-bit integer. For floating point, we have doubles, float, and decimal, where decimal has the most precision and is of type NS decimal internally, which is a holdover from Objective-C. We have string, which is the type that we're going to use for the name attribute. We have Boolean. We have date. We have binary data. UUID, URI, and transformable. So what we're going to use here is the string type for the name of the project. We're going to add another attribute, and we're going to call it isClosed. And then we're going to make this a Boolean. And then finally, we'll have an expected close date. We'll say this is going to be a date, like that. We're going to add another attribute, and this is going to be created at. And this is also going to be a date. And then one last attribute, last modified at. Date. So, what this is going to do is it's pretty much going to say pretty much what these are going to do: last modified at and created at. These are not properties that you're going to set on your own. We're going to have default values set for these depending on the situation. So created at will only ever be initialized once when the object is created. So whenever we choose to create a new core data object, we're going to set that value by default and then never set it again. Now, for last modified at, that will change every time because every time the object gets modified, we want to keep track of when it was last modified. This is especially useful if you are using, say, a document management app or a project management app or something like that, and you want to keep track of when something was last modified. This technique is useful in that sort of case. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and go into our task item entity and add some attributes to that. All right, so for the attributes of our task item, again, I'm going to have an ID. So we'll say ID, and this is going to be of type UUID. Then we'll have a title. This title is going to be string. We'll have an is complete. So we'll make this a Boolean. There we go. So is complete is going to be a Boolean. We are going to have another attribute, expected completion date. This is going to be a date. And then two more attributes. Created at which is going to be a date, and then the last attribute, last modified at, and then that will be a date. Perfect. Now that we have all of that working, or now that we have all of that done, that is essentially how we can create our data models on a basic level. However, in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to finish off creating our data models by taking a look at how we can add a relationship between these two entities, and we'll talk about the different supported relationship types in core data, as well as how we can make working with our core data code slightly easier because of how core data and Swift handle optionality. All right, that pretty much does it, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.